Welcome to Afterlife Topics and Metaphysics. Let's talk about the ego because this is something that is discussed so much by people in spiritual communities, sometimes a bit haphazardly. And so I think it's about time to make a little video to talk a little bit about the topic and at least touch on the surface of it. I'm no psychologist, I'm no psychiatrist, so I don't have a clinical education in the ego. That's kind of okay because it seems like the people who toss around the term ego don't either. So, by the way, before we begin, this is Afterlife Topics and Metaphysics. We talk about exotic paranormal subjects like life after death and the specifics of those types of things. And there's a lot to go over. If it's your first time here, maybe go back and look through some of the early videos or check out afterlifetopics.com or my book Understanding Life After Death, where we explore the topic that all of us survive death and go into parallel dimensions, which an incredible amount of evidence is pointing us toward. And if you like this kind of thing, please hit the subscribe button, the big red button down there. You may need to log into your Gmail account to do so. Subscribing literally keeps this channel going because it helps the algorithm that allows YouTube to recommend the video to more people. So everybody's subscribing a lot. I've seen now that YouTube recommendations going up slowly because of the likes and because of the subscribes and shares. So if you want to help with that, I really appreciate it. To continue. So the term ego dates to the Freudian era, so the early-ish 1900s, 1920s, around that time. And according to the Freudian model of the psyche, the id is the set of uncoordinated instinctual trends, which kind of sounds to me like the limbic system, which we talked a little bit in the previous video. The superego plays the critical and moralizing role, and the ego is the organized, realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? As Freud explained, the functional importance of the ego is manifested in the fact that normally control over the approaches to motility devolves upon it. I think we have to unpack that sentence carefully because that one's a little bit over my head. Thus, in its relation to the id, it is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. So you're keeping in check your baseline instinctual animal drives. With this difference, the rider tries to do so with his own strength, while the ego uses borrowed forces. The analogy may be carried a little further. Often a rider, if he is not to be parted from his horse, is obliged to guide it where it wants to go. So in the same way, the ego is in the habit of transforming the id's will into action as if it were its own. So let's say you have uncoordinated instinctual sort of baseline limbic system stuff going on, and then the ego might be there rationalizing that into the realm of higher consciousness in a sense. So in some ways, that is problematic if your primitive drives are telling you to do something a bit destructive, and then your ego is kind of rationalizing that away. But that might not even be the clearest explanation or the most accurate explanation, because this was not my major back in the old university system. So ultimately, though, I think what we are looking at, though, is a definition of the ego operating in such a way that it is organizing and mediating baseline desires and the more critical sides of the superego. And it's definitely something that seems like the necessary component of consciousness, because you have on one hand more baseline, I don't want to say darker, but potentially darker tendencies, and then you have the superego that's been attaching moral significance to everything, and then you have the ego stepping in and trying to find a nice sensible middle ground. Now, this definition is not quite the same definition that I think has entered into common vernacular. Because what we see now all the time in spiritual books, lore, people talking pseudo-spirituality, and lots of people, making posts on Facebook groups saying we need to shed the ego. And not until there is no more ego are we achieve nirvana or something along those lines. We don't achieve a Zen level of supreme consciousness until we get rid of the ego. Well, based on Freud's definition, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Especially if the ego is the thing that's regulating more baseline instincts, right? Shouldn't they be saying we need to get rid of the id? Isn't the id like the darker, deeper instinctual drives that are not related to higher consciousness? Isn't that kind of the thing that we should be getting rid of? But no, people say the ego. But then people use the ego usually as like an insult. So you have somebody who's very arrogant and doesn't seem to be able to look at him or herself or empathize with other people, and then they say this person has a big ego. So by that definition, ego now means something else. By that definition, the ego appears to involve a sense of apathy or a sense of detachment from other people, right? So, okay, in this sense, maybe now we're getting somewhere. If we can define spirituality, pretty nebulous term, as our sense of connectedness with others or the world around us, then the ego could be the sense of separation from others and the world around us. And this is not what Freud said, but we're using the word ego, so let's go with it. This is a different territory. This is something else. So let's say ego 2.0. So ego 2.0 is the consciousness sense of individuality separated from others. Now, next point, is that a bad thing? Well, it can be a bad thing if somebody can't empathize easily or is disconnected from the sense of consciousness of other people and other things, and they are very self-focused, self-driven, and care about showing themselves off as being superior to others, because this is like the natural instinct that arises if you don't recognize the existence of other people or things. Then this is a damaging state of mind that will ultimately prevent a person's long-term success, because they're not unionizing with other souls, other things around it. They are acting a bit more cancerously. They're just going crazy, going renegade, and not cooperating, not joining with others, or being holistic. They're becoming very selfish. So this could be what we'd say ego 2.0, out of control. But is even ego 2.0 such a bad thing? Because if we had no sense of individuality and separation from others, we wouldn't be the people we are. We would be something that, would be completely amorphous. We wouldn't have that sense of being able to recognize ourselves as being different and then being able to use that difference to connect to others. We would kind of be almost like we wouldn't even be like a human consciousness. We'd just be a bunch of stuff. We'd be anything that gets thrown at it, Anything it meets, it'll change to that color. So if you have no sense of separation and you hang around a bunch of angry people, then that whatever that thing is that doesn't have an ego is going to become whatever it's exposed to. It's going to be basically a blank canvas that's continually going blank again and just being whatever it's around. And this doesn't seem to be a healthy way of existence either. And it also seems like nobody really is eliminating the ego entirely. So I disagree with a lot of this like Eastern religion 2.0 that comes around, that became popular, I guess, in like the 70s and that whole era. And you hear people say we must completely get rid of the ego. I don't think they know what they're. First of all, they don't know what they're talking about in relation to what Freud said. And number two, if they're talking about the ego on these terminologies, then you will never get rid of the ego. Even if you're like some eighth density entity living in some exalted dimension, you're still going to have a sense, enough of a separation sense, to be able to command its own destiny and not become a blank slate. Because you don't necessarily want to become a blank slate. You want to have that sense of separation enough that you can, for one thing, be able to love properly other souls. So if you're just, a marionette doll being pushed around by every whimsical force in nature, then doesn't seem like a sustainable type of existence. So the big point here before you close up this video is, I don't see the ego. Scroll around a little bit. There's a big Wikipedia article. You can learn more about the Freudian concepts behind it. But I don't think that the ego is something anyone's getting rid of. I think what these spiritual teachers are trying to say is that a key to enlightenment is lessening the sense of individual separation from others while still being your own individually separated entity. That's a paradox, but it's not really a paradox. It just means be yourself, but feel and enjoy the moment and everything around you. And I would almost argue it's like you need to have a strong sense of individuality, because there's empaths out there and they're just an emotional wreck. I mean, they see, like they step on a worm and they begin crying about it. They see something sad on the news and their whole day is wrecked. These are empaths who haven't developed like the individual separation type callus that's needed to be able to operate and navigate in a fluctuating world and become kind of like a rock. You have to become like a rock in a storm. The storm is happening around you. You must learn to become that rock that can withstand whatever is happening around it, while at the same time being able to love and appreciate and be interconnected with the stuff that's happening around it. That's kind of the balance we're looking at. That's what I work towards, and I think I've made a lot of progress in that area. But that's also part, I think, of what we mean by raising up your consciousness. So if you want to become interconnected to all things, that's wonderful, but you also have to have that firm boundary in place as well. So you have to juggle both these things at once. You can see it in real time. In some ways, I almost see people with certain personality disorders as being unable to develop that sense of individual separation just enough. Maybe even like borderline personality or certain characteristics that, as an example, like some people, there's some really crazy paradoxes here. Like, you can be so be missing that sense of individual strength, being that rock, to where any slight breeze pushes you around. Then as a result, you develop like this really, really bad ego, where if somebody says the slightest wrong thing to you, you become insulted and angry at them and you flip out. Like we see with certain types of personality disorders, they'll switch over and then they'll just hate you immediately if they perceive you as having slighted them. This could be the result of somebody who is extremely empathic, who has developed this very overblown callus to try to defend itself from having its emotions continually being threatened and ripped apart. So that's something to chew on. But this is all complicated stuff. I can go on all night. I'll do more videos about this, so let me know specifically some things you want to address or want me to talk about in the comments. You can get involved at afterlifetopics.com. You can learn about the major stuff we talk about here. You can check out books like Understanding Life After Death, the Facebook group of the same name as this channel, or the classes where you can become a patron at $30 a month and help keep this whole thing going. I only have like a dozen patrons. Anybody else who wants to jump in and join the classes twice a week, very, very in-depth stuff, even more in-depth than like what we talk about right here in this channel. It'll help keep this channel going and the group going, the books going. And so you can shoot me a message on here, on Facebook, wherever, to get involved with that. I'll see you next time, and be sure to keep that ego 2.0 in check. Stay interconnected with everybody else around you. Learn to enjoy that level of consciousness, but don't do it to the point where you become a blank canvas, just absorbing everything around it, because that won't help anybody either.